The grenade crashed through the diner window, and Sarah had 3 seconds to save her daughter. But a homeless boy she'd never met threw himself over the device and took the full blast. When Sarah pulled a blood-stained photograph from his pocket, her hands started shaking. The boy was holding a picture of her husband with a dead Hells Angels enforcer. On the back were 5 words: "Brotherhood doesn't end with blood." Who was this kid? And what secret was her husband hiding that was worth a child's life? Before we continue, please like and subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The grenade hit the window of Rosie's Diner at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon in Riverside, California, and William had less than 3 seconds to decide whether to save 2 strangers or save himself. He'd been standing near the restroom hallway, 14 years old and hollow-eyed from 8 months on the streets, watching the woman and little girl in booth 7 the way he'd watched them for weeks. Sarah with her nervous hands cutting pancakes into perfect squares, Amelia with syrup on her chin and a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The black SUV across Market Street had been idling for 6 minutes with its engine running and windows cracked, and William knew that sound, that predatory waiting, because his father Marcus Reaper Chun had taught him to read violence the way other kids read comic books. When the rear passenger window rolled down and the figure in the black mask pulled the pin on the M67 fragmentation grenade, William's body moved before his brain caught up, legs pumping across the checkered linoleum floor as the explosive device tumbled end over end through the air in slow motion, trailing its safety lever like a metal butterfly. He didn't think about the fact that he weighed 98 pounds soaking wet, or that his ribs were visible through his torn Dodgers hoodie, or that nobody had called him by his real name in 243 days. He thought about the photograph folded in his pocket, his father's arm around a tattooed biker named Daniel outside a clubhouse in Oakland, both men grinning like brothers. And how Marcus had made him memorize that face before the prison guards dragged him away for the last time. Sarah looked up from Amelia's plate just as William's sneakers skidded across spilled orange juice, her eyes going wide as the grenade crashed through the plate glass window in an explosion of glittering shards, bouncing once on the tile before rolling to a stop 3 feet from her daughter's pink sneakers. William didn't hesitate. He threw himself forward in a diving tackle that would have made his middle school football coach proud if he'd ever had the chance to play organized sports instead of surviving foster homes and soup kitchen lines, his body covering the grenade completely as his chest hit the floor and his arms wrapped around the M67 like he was hugging a football. Sarah screamed and grabbed Amelia, yanking her daughter under the table just as the world exploded into fire and thunder and a pressure wave that turned the air into a solid wall of force. The blast lifted William's body 6 inches off the ground before slamming him back down, shrapnel tearing through his back and shoulders and legs, metal fragments designed to kill enemy soldiers in combat zones now embedded in the thin frame of a homeless boy who decided 2 lives were worth more than his own. The diner windows blew outward in a cascade of safety glass that rained down on Market Street like diamond hail, car alarms shrieking, smoke billowing from the epicenter where booth 7 had been, and somewhere through the ringing in Sarah's ears, she heard Amelia sobbing and her own voice making sounds that didn't form words. The black SUV's tires screeched as it peeled away from the curb, disappearing into Riverside traffic before anyone could read the license plate. And Sarah pulled herself and Amelia out from under the table on hands and knees, crawling through debris and blood and the acrid smell of cordite that reminded her of things she'd buried deep in her past. William was lying on his stomach in the center of a blast radius, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his back, and the amount of blood pooling around him made Sarah's combat medic training kick in before her civilian panic could take over. She pressed her hands against the largest wound she could see, her fingers coming away crimson, and Amelia was screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy," in a loop that might never stop, and other diners were stumbling toward the exit or hiding behind overturned tables, and the waitress named Rosie who'd served them coffee was on her phone with 911 dispatch saying words like explosion and casualties, and hurry, please God, hurry. Sarah ripped off her cardigan and packed it against William's back, applying pressure the way she'd been taught at Camp Pendleton a lifetime ago. And she was whispering, "Stay with me, kid, stay with me," even though she had no idea who he was or why he'd just sacrificed himself for her family. His face was turned to the side, cheek pressed against the tile, and his eyes were half open and unfocused, lips moving without sound. And Sarah leaned closer to hear him whisper 3 words that didn't make sense. "Tell Daniel, brotherhood." Then his eyes rolled back and his body went slack, and Sarah felt for a pulse in his neck with trembling fingers, finding a thread-like flutter that could disappear any second. The sirens arrived 4 minutes later, which felt like 4 hours, and EMTs in Riverside Fire Department uniforms flooded through the shattered entrance with stretchers and medical kits, and the efficient urgency of people who'd seen too much trauma. They took over from Sarah with practiced hands, cutting away William's hoodie to expose the shrapnel wounds, starting 4 lines, barking medical terminology that Sarah understood better than she should have, and the senior paramedic, a woman named Chun with kind eyes, looked at Sarah and said, "You saved his life with that pressure, ma'am. Good work," before they loaded William onto the stretcher. Subscribe now. You never know when you'll need to save someone you love. Sarah climbed into the ambulance with Amelia clutching her waist because she couldn't explain why, but she knew she had to stay with this boy, had to understand why he knew her husband's name, had to make sure he survived whatever insanity had just torn through their normal Saturday afternoon. The ambulance screamed through Riverside streets toward the University Medical Center trauma unit. And through the rear windows, Sarah watched the black smoke rising from Rosie's diner like a funeral pyre, and she thought about the SUV and the calculated violence, and how this wasn't random, wasn't an accident, wasn't anything close to over. Riverside University Medical Center's emergency room was controlled chaos, doctors and nurses converging on William's stretcher the moment they wheeled him through the automatic doors, voices overlapping with 14-year-old male, multiple penetrating shrapnel wounds, BP dropping, possible internal bleeding. Get him to Trauma Bay 3 now. Sarah stood in the hallway holding Amelia, both of them covered in blood that wasn't theirs, and a nurse tried to escort them to the waiting room, but Sarah refused to move until someone told her whether the boy would live. A doctor emerged 20 minutes later, a tired-looking man in his 50s with surgical scrubs and the bearing of someone who delivered bad news professionally. And he looked at Sarah with the expression that meant start preparing yourself. He took the full blast, the doctor said, his voice flat with clinical detachment that barely masked exhaustion. "No one survives that kind of shrapnel damage. We're doing everything we can, but you should prepare for the worst. Are you family?" Sarah shook her head, unable to explain that she was a stranger who this boy had died for, and the doctor nodded and disappeared back through the trauma bay doors, leaving Sarah alone with Amelia and a waiting room full of other people's emergencies. A police officer arrived to take her statement, a young cop named Rodriguez who wrote everything down in a notebook and said the words "gang-related" and "ongoing investigation," and "you're lucky to be alive, ma'am." He asked if Sarah had enemies, if her husband had connections to criminal organizations, if she'd seen anything suspicious before the attack, and Sarah answered carefully because yes, Daniel was a top member of the Hells Angels, and yes, she knew exactly what kind of world they lived in, but she'd never imagined that world would follow them to a diner on a Saturday afternoon. Rodriguez took William's torn hoodie as evidence, sealing it in a plastic bag, and Sarah watched him handle it and felt something cold twist in her stomach because she needed to know who this boy was, needed to understand the connection. She waited until Rodriguez left to interview other witnesses. Then she approached the evidence bag sitting on the nurse's station counter and did something she'd never done before. She reached in and pulled out the hoodie before anyone could stop her. The photograph fell from the front pocket, landing face up on the linoleum floor. Sarah picked it up with shaking hands and felt the world tilt sideways. 2 men stood outside a clubhouse in Oakland, arms around each other's shoulders, leather vests marking them as Hells Angels brothers, both grinning at the camera with the easy confidence of men who'd faced death together and won. One of them was Daniel, younger by a few years but unmistakable with his sleeve tattoos and the scar over his left eyebrow from a bar fight in Nevada. The other man was Asian, heavily muscled, with Reaper patched across his vest and eyes that carried the weight of violence. Sarah knew that face. Daniel had come home 6 months ago from a prison visit with red-rimmed eyes and a bottle of whiskey, and he told her Marcus, Reaper, Chen had been killed in a riot, and they'd gotten drunk together while Daniel talked about brotherhood and loyalty and debts that could never be repaid. But Daniel had never mentioned Marcus having a son, had never said a word about a 14-year-old boy who might be out there somewhere, alone, unprotected. Had never given Sarah any reason to believe he was keeping secrets that could get people killed. If you're still watching without subscribing, comment below, what secrets would you keep to protect your family? Sarah turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who didn't write often, were 5 words. Brotherhood doesn't end with blood. She stared at those words while Amelia pulled at her sleeve asking when they could go home, and Sarah's hands were shaking so hard the photograph nearly slipped from her fingers. 6 months ago Daniel came home and told her Marcus was dead. 6 months ago he'd gotten drunk and mourned and made promises to empty air about taking care of what Marcus left behind. But he'd never mentioned a son, had never said the name William, had never explained why a homeless 14-year-old boy with Marcus Chen's eyes would be watching their family from the shadows, carrying a photograph of Daniel like a talisman, waiting for the moment when he could prove that brotherhood didn't end with blood by throwing himself on a grenade to save Daniel's wife and daughter. Sarah looked at the photograph of her husband and Marcus Reaper Chun, their arms around each other like brothers, both smiling at the camera without knowing that years later one of them would be dead in prison and the other would be lying to his wife about something far darker than she'd ever imagined. And Sarah realized with a cold certainty that settled in her bones like frost that she didn't know her husband at all, didn't understand what promises he'd made or what debts he owed or what kind of danger he'd brought to their doorstep. The grenade attack wasn't random. The boy wasn't a stranger. And Daniel had been lying to her for 6 months about something important enough that people were willing to kill children to keep it buried. She stood in the emergency room hallway holding a photograph of 2 men who called each other brothers, while in trauma bay 3 of their doctors fought to save the life of a homeless boy who decided her family was worth dying for. And Sarah understood with absolute clarity that nothing would ever be normal again. Daniel's phone exploded with Sarah's call at 3:15 p.m. while he was standing in the Hells Angels clubhouse in San Bernardino, 3 beers deep into a Saturday afternoon poker game with Viper and 2 prospects who were learning the hard way not to bluff against the club president. The moment he heard Sarah's voice, high and shaking and wrong in a way that made his blood freeze. He was moving toward his Harley before she finished saying the words explosion and Amelia's safe, and there's a boy, Daniel. He saved us, he's dying. He didn't ask questions, didn't explain to Viper why he was suddenly running for the exit, just shouted, Riverside Medical Center. Sarah and Amelia attacked, over his shoulder, and kicked his bike to life with enough force to crack the kickstand. The ride from San Bernardino to Riverside usually took 45 minutes in traffic, but Daniel made it in 28, weaving between cars on the 60 freeway with his engine screaming and his mind racing through every enemy he'd made in 15 years wearing the Hells Angels patch. The Diablos topped that list. They'd been at war since the Vegas weapons deal went sideways 2 weeks ago, 3 of their members dead and the club's reputation bleeding out in the desert. But Daniel had kept his family separate from that world, had built walls between his leather vest and Sarah's suburban life, had promised himself that Amelia would never see the violence that defined his brotherhood. He burst through the emergency room doors at Riverside University Medical Center, looking like exactly what he was, a 6'2" biker with full-sleeve tattoos and murder in his eyes. And the security guard reached for his radio before Sarah appeared from the waiting room and ran to him. Amelia was right behind her, and Daniel dropped to one knee to wrap his arms around his daughter, feeling her shake against his chest, her voice muffled against his leather vest saying, Daddy, there was a boom, and the boy saved us, and Mommy has blood on her. Daniel looked up at Sarah over Amelia's head, and saw something in his wife's face he'd never seen before. Not fear, not relief, but a cold fury that made him think of wounded animals backed into corners. She was holding something in her hand, and when she thrust it toward him without a word, Daniel's heart stopped completely. The photograph was creased and stained with blood, but he recognized it immediately. Oakland Clubhouse, 2023, his arm around Marcus Reaper, Chun after they'd survived the Diablo's ambush in Los Angeles that should have killed them both. Daniel's mouth went dry as he stared at the image, and when he looked back at Sarah, her expression told him she'd already connected everything he'd been trying to keep hidden. Who was Marcus Chen's son? Sarah's voice was quiet, controlled, dangerous. And why didn't you tell me he existed? Around them, the emergency room continued its normal chaos of crying children and beeping monitors and announcements over the PA system. But Daniel felt like they were standing in a vacuum where sound couldn't reach. Amelia was still pressed against him, and he gently transferred her to a waiting room chair with her stuffed rabbit before standing to face his wife. His mind was spinning through responses, through lies and half-truths and deflections, but Sarah's eyes stopped him cold because she already knew he'd been keeping secrets, and any more dishonesty right now would burn down whatever trust they had left. His name is William, Daniel said finally, his voice rough. Marcus had a kid from a relationship before the club. I knew about him. I thought. He stopped, ran a hand over his face, felt the weight of a broken promise crushing his chest. I thought the foster system placed him with family in Oregon after Marcus died. I looked for him, Sarah. For 2 months I searched, but every lead went nowhere, and I assumed he was safe somewhere, being taken care of, living a normal life away from all this. The waiting room felt too small suddenly, too exposed, and Daniel guided Sarah and Amelia to a corner near the vending machines where they had some privacy. A nurse tried to offer them coffee, but Sarah waved her away with barely controlled impatience, her attention locked on Daniel like a laser sight. That boy has been homeless, Sarah said, each word precise and cutting, living on the streets of Riverside, watching our family. And today he threw himself on a grenade to save me and Amelia. She held up the photograph again, her hand shaking now. Brotherhood doesn't end with blood. That's what it says on the back. What does that mean, Daniel? What promise did you make to Marcus? Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, a wound he'd been trying to ignore for 6 months, and he leaned back against the wall because his legs suddenly felt unreliable. Marcus saved my life, he said quietly, looking at his daughter instead of his wife because Amelia's innocent face was easier than Sarah's accusatory stare. 3 years ago, Diablo's ambush in LA, 5 of them waiting outside a strip club we were collecting from. They had automatic weapons and a plan to execute me in the parking lot, send a message to the club about territory. Marcus saw it coming, pushed me behind a car, took 3 bullets that were meant for my skull. The flashback hit Daniel with physical force, the sound of gunfire echoing off concrete. Marcus's body jerking as rounds punched through his vest, the wet cough and blood on his lips as Daniel dragged him behind cover and returned fire until the Diablos scattered. The ride to the hospital with Marcus bleeding out in his arms, both of them knowing he'd just traded his life for Daniel's, the unspoken debt settling between them heavier than any words. He survived, Daniel continued, his voice distant now, lost in memory. Barely. Spent 2 weeks in ICU. And when he woke up, he didn't ask for gratitude or payback. He just said, brotherhood doesn't end with blood, and we were square. But they weren't square, not really, because that kind of debt could never be repaid with words or money or favors. When Marcus got arrested 6 months later on weapons charges, taking the fall for a club operation that would have landed Daniel in federal prison, Daniel had visited him every week, promised to look after his son, sworn that William would never be alone. Marcus made me promise, Daniel said, meeting Sarah's eyes now, before the prison riot killed him. He said, find my boy, keep him safe, give him what I couldn't. And I tried. Sarah, I swear to God I tried. But the foster system stonewalled me, said they couldn't release information, and every private investigator I hired came back empty. Sarah was silent for a long moment, processing, and Daniel could see her mind working through implications and timelines and lies of omission. "So that boy has been out there for 8 months," she said finally. "Alone. Starving. Probably following us because he found that photograph and thought you'd honor your promise to his father." The guilt hit Daniel like a sledgehammer because yes, that's exactly what happened, and William had been invisible to him. Another homeless kid on Riverside streets that Daniel drove past without seeing, without recognizing, without saving. "I failed him," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking. "I failed Marcus. And today that 14-year-old boy paid for my failure by throwing himself on a grenade meant for my family." Amelia looked up from her rabbit, confused by her father's tears, and Sarah pulled her close with one arm while still holding the photograph with the other. The moment hung between them, fragile and sharp, until the trauma bay doors swung open and a doctor approached wearing the exhausted expression of someone fighting a losing battle. "Are you the family?" the doctor asked, looking between Daniel and Sarah with uncertainty because they clearly weren't dressed like typical suburban parents. Daniel in his leather vest, and Sarah still wearing blood-soaked clothes. "We're his family," Sarah said firmly, leaving no room for argument, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest because his wife had just claimed a homeless boy she'd met an hour ago as their own. The doctor nodded, consulting a tablet. "William is alive, but barely. Multiple penetrating wounds, significant internal bleeding, damage to his liver, spleen, and left kidney. He needs immediate surgery, but it's going to be extensive. We're talking 6 to 8 hours in the OR, possible complications, long recovery even if everything goes perfectly." The doctor paused, and Daniel knew what was coming next because he'd heard this speech before when Marcus was bleeding out 3 years ago. "The surgery will cost approximately $180,000 without insurance." "Does William have coverage?" Daniel's stomach dropped. The club's funds were frozen. DEA had raided their accounts 2 weeks ago as part of the Vegas investigation. Everything locked down pending federal review. His personal savings wouldn't cover half of that amount, and they needed the money now, not after lawyers unfroze assets in 6 months. "How long do we have?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. The doctor checked his watch with clinical precision. "He's stable for now, but we need to operate within the next 2 hours or his chances drop significantly. I'll need payment confirmation before we can proceed." He didn't say the rest, that hospitals didn't perform expensive surgeries on homeless teenagers without guaranteed payment, that William would be stabilized and transferred to county care where he'd wait on a list while his organs failed. But Daniel heard it anyway in the careful neutrality of the doctor's tone. As the doctor walked away, a hospital administrator materialized from nowhere, a thin man in a cheap suit with the predatory efficiency of someone whose job was extracting money from desperate people. His eyes locked onto Daniel's visible tattoos, the Hell's Angels patch on his vest, the general aura of controlled violence that Daniel carried like cologne. "Mr." the administrator began, checking his clipboard. "I don't see William's last name in our system, and I noticed your club affiliation." His smile was cold, professional. "I'm going to need payment guarantees before surgery, or I'll have to contact local authorities about potential gang activity on hospital premises." The threat was clear. Pay up or Daniel would have cops crawling all over him, asking questions about the Grenade attack and gang wars, and why a Hell's Angels member was suddenly interested in a dying homeless boy. Daniel felt rage building in his throat, hot and acidic. But Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him from doing something stupid like breaking the administrator's jaw in front of security cameras. "We'll get you the money," Sarah said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. 2 hours. The administrator nodded and disappeared, and Daniel immediately pulled out his phone to call Viper. His club president answered on the second ring, voice sharp with concern. "Talk to me." Daniel explained in rapid sentences William's identity, the surgery, the cost, the frozen accounts, and Viper was silent for exactly 3 seconds before responding. "Emergency vote. I'll call the full patch members. We can liquidate the bar's equipment, pull from personal stashes, call in debts. For Reaper's kid, for the boy who saved your family, we'll make it happen." Daniel felt his throat close up because this was brotherhood. This was what the patch meant beyond the violence and territory and criminal enterprise. Taking care of your own, honoring debts, protecting family even when family was a homeless teenager you'd never met. He hung up and turned to Sarah, about to explain that the club would come through, when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Daniel's blood went cold as he read the message, and Sarah saw his expression change and grabbed his wrist. "What is it?" Daniel turned the phone so she could see. The text was short, brutal, accompanied by a Diablo's gang emoji. "The boy dies tonight. So does your family. You should have stayed out of Vegas." Sarah's face went white, and Daniel's eyes snapped to the hospital entrance, just in time to see two figures in black hoodies pushing through the automatic doors, hands concealed in their jacket pockets, moving with the casual purposefulness of men who'd come to finish what the grenade started. His hand went instinctively to his belt, but he wasn't carrying. You didn't bring weapons into hospitals. And the figures were scanning the emergency room with methodical precision, looking for Booth 7 survivors. Daniel grabbed Sarah's arm and Amelia's hand, his voice low and urgent. "Fourth floor surgical waiting room. Now, lock the door, don't come out until I call you." Sarah started to argue, but Daniel's expression stopped her cold because she'd never seen that look before. Pure predatory focus, the face of a man who'd killed before and would kill again to protect what was his. Sarah scooped up Amelia and ran for the stairwell, and Daniel turned to face the two figures who'd just spotted him across the emergency room, their eyes locking onto his Hell's Angels patch with recognition and intent. And as they started moving toward him with their hands emerging from their pockets revealing the dark shapes of concealed weapons, Daniel realized with absolute certainty that the next 10 minutes would determine whether his family lived or died, whether he could honor his promise to Marcus, whether brotherhood meant anything beyond words inked on photographs and blood spilled on concrete. And he was 45 minutes away from backup with two armed Diablo's hitmen closing the distance between them and William lying unconscious in a trauma bay with no one to protect him except a biker with a broken promise and empty hands. Daniel had exactly 4 seconds before the first hitman reached striking distance, and he used 3 of them to calculate angles and exits and the location of every security camera in the Riverside University Medical Center emergency room. The 4th second he spent grabbing a metal force stand from an abandoned gurney and swinging it like a baseball bat at the nearest overhead light fixture, shattering the fluorescent tubes and plunging that section of the ER into flickering darkness punctuated by emergency exit signs. The Diablo's hitman on the left, tall, Hispanic, neck tattoos visible above his hoodie collar, pulled a Glock from his waistband, but hesitated because hospital security was 20 feet away and gunshots would bring every cop in Riverside crashing through those doors. That hesitation cost him. Daniel closed the distance in 2 strides and drove the force stand's base into the hitman's solar plexus hard enough to fold him in half, then brought his knee up into the man's descending face with a crack that sounded like breaking pottery. The Glock clattered across the linoleum and Daniel kicked it under a vending machine, his hands already moving to intercept the second hitman, who was circling right with a knife extended low and professional, the kind of blade work that spoke of prison yards and close-quarters killing. The emergency room erupted into chaos, nurses screaming, patients scrambling for exits, security guard Rodriguez shouting into his radio for backup. But Daniel's focus narrowed to the 6 feet of space between him and the man trying to gut him. The hitman feinted left and slashed right, a move Daniel recognized from street fighting outside the San Bernardino clubhouse, and he twisted sideways, feeling the blade whisper past his ribs close enough to slice through his shirt. Daniel grabbed a rolling tray of medical instruments and hurled it at the hitman's face, scalpels and forceps scattering like shrapnel, buying himself 2 seconds to reach the stairwell door where Sarah had disappeared with Amelia. He slammed through it with the second hitman right behind him, the knife scoring a line across his shoulder blade that burned hot and immediate. And Daniel knew he was bleeding but couldn't stop to assess damage because Sarah and Amelia were 4 floors up and completely unprotected. The hitman tackled him on the landing between first and second floors, both men crashing into concrete walls hard enough to crack ribs, and Daniel tasted copper in his mouth as they grappled for control of the knife. They rolled down 3 steps locked together, Daniel's head bouncing off the edge of a riser, stars exploding across his vision, the hitman's weight pressing down on him with the knife point hovering 6 inches from his throat. Daniel could smell the man's breath, cigarettes and rage and the chemical tang of methamphetamine. And he realized with cold clarity that this wasn't just gang business. This was personal, the kind of hatred that came from watching friends die in the Vegas desert. The hitman's free hand wrapped around Daniel's throat, squeezing, cutting off air, and Daniel's peripheral vision started darkening into tunnel vision that meant unconsciousness was seconds away. His right hand scrabbled across the concrete landing searching for anything, finding nothing, fingers closing on empty air until they brushed against something metal wedged in the corner, a fire extinguisher bracket mount torn loose from the wall. Daniel's fingers wrapped around it, and he swung blindly upward, catching the hitman across the temple with enough force to snap the man's head sideways. The grip on his throat loosened and Daniel sucked in air that tasted like blood and freedom, then swung again and again until the hitman collapsed sideways and stopped moving. Daniel dragged himself upright, panting, bleeding from his shoulder and a cut above his eye he didn't remember receiving, and stared down at the unconscious Diablo's member. The man's Glock 19 was tucked into an ankle holster. Daniel pulled it free, checked the magazine by muscle memory, found it fully loaded with one in the chamber. Somewhere below them, security was flooding the stairwell, and somewhere above, the first hitman Daniel had dropped in the ER was probably regaining consciousness and calling for backup. Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time toward the 4th floor, his legs burning and his shoulders screaming protest with every movement, and he was replaying Sarah's face in his mind. The cold fury, the controlled fear, the absolute determination to protect Amelia, and he realized he'd never actually asked his wife about her past before they met, had never questioned why a suburban mother moved with the efficiency of someone trained for violence. 4th floor surgical waiting room, he'd told her, but as Daniel burst through the stairwell door into the corridor, he saw the first hitman from the ER limping toward a locked door at the end of the hall, his face a mask of blood from the broken nose Daniel had given him, and the hitman was raising his boot to kick down the door behind which Sarah and Amelia were trapped. Daniel raised the Glock and shouted, "Federal officer, drop your weapon," a lie that bought him exactly 1 second as the hitman spun toward him instead of breaking through the door. 1 second was enough. Daniel closed half the distance before the hitman's gun came up, and they collided in the hallway outside the surgical waiting room in a tangle of fists and elbows and desperate close quarters grappling where neither of them could get a clear shot. They crashed through the door of a medical supply room, shelves collapsing around them in an avalanche of gauze packages and sterile instrument trays, both men fighting with the vicious intensity of people who understood only one of them would walk out. The hitman was younger, faster, less injured, and he got his forearm across Daniel's throat in a chokehold that made black spots dance across Daniel's vision. Daniel drove his elbow backward into the man's kidney once, twice, 3 times, feeling something give, hearing the hitman's breath explode out in a pained grunt. The chokehold loosened enough for Daniel to twist free and grab a metal bedpan from the wreckage around them, swinging it with everything he had left into the side of the hitman's skull. The impact echoed in the small room like a gong, and the hitman dropped like his strings had been cut. Daniel stood over the unconscious man, chest heaving, blood dripping from his shoulder and face onto the white linoleum, and for a moment the only sound was his own ragged breathing. He took the hitman's Glock, better armed than sorry, and stumbled out of the supply room toward the surgical waiting room door that was still locked. "Sarah," he called, his voice hoarse. "It's me. It's over." For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened, and Daniel's mind raced through terrible possibilities of other hitmen, other entrances, other ways the Diablos could have reached his family. Then he heard the lock click and the door opened 6 inches, and Sarah's face appeared in the gap, not tearful or relieved or traumatized, but coldly assessing, her eyes scanning Daniel for injuries before checking the hallway behind him with the systematic precision of someone trained in threat assessment. She opened the door wider and Daniel saw Amelia sitting in a corner behind an overturned couch, her rabbit clutched to her chest, her eyes enormous and shell-shocked. But what stopped Daniel cold was the way Sarah had barricaded the door. Furniture stacked strategically to create choke points, a fire extinguisher positioned at head height for anyone forcing entry, and in her right hand a scalpel she'd somehow acquired, held low and ready with the grip of someone who knew exactly where to cut to end a fight quickly. "Where'd you get that?" Daniel asked, nodding at the scalpel, and Sarah followed his gaze to her own hand like she'd forgotten she was holding a weapon. "Supply cart in the hallway," she said, setting it down carefully on a side table. "Before I locked us in." She moved to Amelia and knelt beside her daughter, checking for injuries with quick, efficient touches, and Daniel watched his wife work and realized he was looking at a stranger. The suburban mother who cut pancakes and drove carpool and worried about Amelia's third-grade math homework was gone, replaced by someone who barricaded doors with tactical efficiency and armed herself without hesitation and showed no visible fear despite having just survived a grenade attack and a siege. "Sarah," Daniel said slowly, "how did you know to do all that?" His wife looked up at him with eyes that carried weight he'd never noticed before, opened her mouth to answer, then froze as footsteps thundered up the stairwell. Multiple footsteps, moving fast, and Daniel raised both Glocks toward the sound before Sarah grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she said. "Those are reinforced combat boots, standard police issue. Listen to the cadence. That's tactical formation, not gang members." Daniel lowered the weapons as a tactical unit flooded the fourth-floor hallway, officers in SWAT gear with assault rifles and ballistic shields, shouting commands to get on the ground. He dropped both Glocks and raised his hands, sinking to his knees while keeping his eyes on Sarah and Amelia, and through the controlled chaos of police securing the floor and checking the two unconscious hitmen, Daniel watched his wife position herself between Amelia and the officers with her hands visible, but her stance balanced, ready to move in any direction, weight distributed like a fighter waiting for the bell. One of the tactical officers, a sergeant with silver hair and a weathered face, approached Sarah to check if she needed medical attention, but stopped 3 feet away and just stared at her. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing the biggest twist. Hit that button before the truth destroys this family. Sergeant Sarah Reeves, the officer said, his voice equal parts confusion and recognition. Task Force Viper, 3rd Marine Division. I served with you in Kabul, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2018. He paused, his eyes scanning Sarah's face like he was seeing a ghost. But you died in a convoy bombing in 2019. I was at your memorial service. The hallway went silent except for the crackle of police radios and the distant sound of sirens. Daniel stared at his wife, at Sarah, at Sergeant Sarah Reeves, at whatever her real name was, and watched all the color drain from her face until she looked like she might collapse. Amelia was asking, "Mommy, what does he mean?" in a small, confused voice. But Sarah couldn't answer because she was locked in a staring contest with the tactical sergeant who'd just blown apart whatever identity she'd been hiding behind. Daniel's mind was racing through their 6 years of marriage, replaying every conversation and story and carefully constructed lie, and he realized with sickening certainty that he'd married a ghost, had built a family with someone who wasn't supposed to exist, had never actually known who his wife really was. "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is he talking about?" But his wife wasn't looking at him anymore, wasn't looking at Amelia or the police or the tactical sergeant who'd recognized her from a life she'd supposedly left buried. She was staring past all of them at something distant and terrible, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat and mechanical, the tone of someone reading from a script. "My name isn't Sarah. My discharge papers say I died 6 years ago. And the people who buried that identity are going to be very interested to know I'm still alive." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him like an earthquake, everything solid suddenly liquid. And he was staring at this woman he'd married and loved and built a life with, and realizing he'd been sleeping next to a stranger who carried secrets deep enough to fake her own death. The tactical sergeant was speaking into his radio, calling for federal marshals, mentioning something about witness protection and classified protocols, and other officers were moving into position around Sarah like she was either extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Amelia started crying, her voice rising to a wail that cut through the professional chaos, and Sarah moved toward her daughter, but two officers stepped between them, and Daniel saw his wife's expression shift from shock to cold calculation. The same look he'd seen on her face when she armed herself with the scalpel, and he understood with horrifying clarity that whatever Sarah had been before she became his wife, whatever Task Force Viper meant, and what happened in Kabul, and why she'd faked her death, it was all coming home now to destroy everything they'd built. And as police separated them into different rooms for questioning, and Amelia's screams echoed down the fourth-floor hallway, Daniel stared at the woman he thought he knew and realized their entire marriage had been constructed on lies. And somewhere 4 floors below them, William was fighting for his life, carrying secrets about Marcus and Vegas and brotherhood, while Daniel's world burned down around him. And he had no idea which fire to fight first, or if any of them would survive what came next. The interrogation room on the 5th floor of Riverside University Medical Center was barely larger than a closet, converted from some administrator's office, with a folding table and 2 plastic chairs that reminded Daniel of every police station he'd ever been dragged into. Detective Marcus, the tactical sergeant who'd recognized Sarah, sat across from him with a file folder and the patient expression of someone who'd interviewed hundreds of criminals and could smell evasion like blood in water. Daniel's shoulder had been bandaged by an ER nurse who'd worked in tense silence, and now the wound throbbed in time with his pulse, while Marcus asked questions Daniel couldn't answer honestly without destroying what remained of his family. "You killed 2 men today," Marcus said, though technically both hitmen were alive and handcuffed to hospital beds under armed guard. "Self-defense is clear, DA won't press charges. But I need to understand the connection. Why did Diablos target your family in a diner?" Daniel leaned back in the plastic chair and weighed his options. The truth would expose club business and ongoing gang war. Lies would trap him when details didn't match, and silence would make him look guilty of something worse than self-defense. "The Vegas weapons deal," Daniel said finally, deciding that partial truth was safer than complete fiction. 2 weeks ago, transaction went bad, 3 Diablos dead, club's finances frozen by DEA. They're retaliating against anyone wearing the patch. Marcus nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer, flipping open his folder to reveal surveillance photos of the diner attack. The black SUV, the grenade mid-flight, William's dive captured in grainy security footage that made Daniel's throat close up. "And the boy?" Marcus asked. "William, how does a homeless 14-year-old fit into a gang war?" Daniel stared at the photo of William throwing himself toward the booth, and felt the weight of Marcus Chen's death settle on him fresh and crushing. "His father saved my life 3 years ago," Daniel said quietly. "Took bullets meant for me. I promised to look after his kid when he died in prison. I failed." The admission hung in the small room like smoke, and Marcus studied Daniel's face with the intensity of someone reading truth in the micro-expressions most people never learn to control. "That's a heavy debt," Marcus said. "Brotherhood doesn't end with blood. That what you people say?" Daniel met his eyes. "That's what we mean." Marcus closed the folder and stood, moving to the small window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, where police cruisers and unmarked sedans filled every available space. "Your wife," he said without turning around. "Sarah, or whatever her real name is. You know she's not who she says she is." It wasn't a question, and Daniel didn't insult either of them by pretending otherwise. "I'm learning that today," Daniel admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion and betrayal that sat in his stomach like broken glass. 6 years of marriage, and I never knew she faked her death. Never knew she served in Afghanistan. Never knew she could fight like that." He paused, remembering Sarah's cold efficiency barricading the door, the scalpel in her practiced grip, the way she'd identified police by their boot cadence. What was she running from? Marcus turned from the window with an expression that mixed professional neutrality and personal sympathy. That's classified above my clearance. But federal marshals are on their way, and when they arrive, Sarah's going into protective custody, whether she wants to or not. Whatever she testified about, whoever she testified against, they're going to want her isolated until they can assess the security breach. Daniel felt panic rising in his chest because isolated meant separated from Amelia, from him, from any chance of explanation or reconciliation. "She's my wife," he said, standing so fast his chair scraped backward. "She's Amelia's mother. You can't just take her." Marcus's expression hardened. "I can't stop federal jurisdiction, and neither can you." He moved to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Sarah Reeves was one of the best combat medics I ever served with. Saved 17 lives under fire in Kabul, got a Bronze Star she never wore. Whatever she's running from, she earned the right to run." He opened the door and stepped aside, and Daniel took that as dismissal, walking out into the hallway where police were still processing the scene and medical staff were navigating around crime scene tape. He headed toward the room where they'd taken Sarah, knowing he probably wouldn't be allowed inside, but needing to try anyway, needing to hear from her own mouth why she'd built their entire marriage on manufactured identity and careful lies. He found her in a consultation room 2 doors down, sitting across from a female officer who was taking notes on a tablet, and when Sarah looked up and saw Daniel in the doorway, something cracked in her carefully controlled expression. The officer started to object to Daniel's presence, but Sarah cut her off. "Give us 5 minutes. Please." The officer looked uncertain, glanced at her tablet like it might contain protocols for this exact situation, then stood and left with a warning that federal marshals would arrive within the hour. The door closed and Daniel and Sarah were alone for the first time since her past exploded into their present, and the silence stretched between them heavy and sharp. "Is Sarah even your real name?" Daniel asked, and his wife, or whoever she was, flinched like he'd struck her. "Yes," she said. "Sarah Reeves is my real name. The identity I gave you, the marriage license, the life we built. That part wasn't fake. I just left out everything that came before." She stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "I testified against military contractors in 2018. Hawthorne Security Group. They were trafficking weapons to Taliban insurgents, selling American tech to the people killing American soldiers. I was a combat medic. I saw the weapons come back against us, saw friends die from equipment that was supposed to be destroyed." The words spilled out now like she'd been holding them back for years, and Daniel listened while his world continued its slow-motion collapse. "I reported it up the chain of command. DOD opened an investigation, subpoenaed me for testimony. Hawthorne had connections, defense contractors with government contracts worth billions, people in very high places who didn't want their money flow disrupted." Sarah's reflection showed strain around her eyes, the weight of memories she'd tried to bury. 3 days after I testified, my convoy was hit by an IED outside Kabul. 5 dead, including my best friend. It was meant to look like routine insurgent attack, but I knew. I'd received threats, messages telling me to recant my testimony or accidents would happen. She turned from the window to face Daniel directly. The DOD offered witness protection. New identity, new life, complete erasure of Sarah Reeves. They faked my death in a convoy bombing, closed casket funeral, full military honors. I became someone else, moved to California, and tried to forget everything I'd seen and done and lost. Her voice broke on the last word. "Then I met you at that bar in Riverside. A biker with kind eyes and a daughter who needed a mother. And I thought maybe I could have a normal life. Maybe the past would stay buried. So I married you, loved you, built a family with you, and never told you the truth because I was terrified the people hunting me would find you and Amelia and punish me by destroying everyone I cared about." Daniel felt anger and sympathy warring in his chest, unable to reconcile the betrayal with the genuine love he'd seen in 6 years of marriage. "You lied to me every day," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Every morning, every night, every time I asked about your past, and you fed me carefully constructed stories. Our entire marriage is built on deception." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "I lied to protect you," she said. "To protect Amelia. If you haven't subscribed, you'll never understand what comes next. Join now before this family tears apart completely. Everything I did was to keep you safe from the kind of people who make witnesses disappear." Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted to forgive the lies and move forward. But trust once broken was nearly impossible to rebuild, and he was staring at his wife and seeing a trained soldier who'd killed insurgents and testified against defense contractors and lived a life of violence he'd never imagined. "I don't even know who you are," he said finally, and Sarah flinched again like each word was a physical blow. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Detective Marcus appeared with an expression of urgent concern. "We've got a problem," he said, gesturing for them to follow. "William's awake, and he's asking for both of you." Daniel and Sarah exchanged glances and moved quickly through the hallway toward the recovery room, where William had been transferred after his initial emergency surgery. They found him lying in a bed surrounded by monitors and 4 drips, his young face pale and drawn but conscious, his eyes tracking their movement as they entered. "You're Daniel," William said, his voice weak but clear. "My father showed me your picture. Said you were brothers." Daniel moved to the bedside, looking down at this boy who carried Marcus's features in the shape of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. "Your father saved my life," Daniel said. "I should have saved yours. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." William shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "You couldn't have found me. I was hiding. Not from you, from them." His hand moved weakly toward his chest. "They weren't after your family today. They were after me." Sarah stepped closer, her combat medic training making her automatically check William's vitals on the monitors. "Who was after you?" she asked gently. William's eyes moved between Daniel and Sarah, calculating something. Then he spoke words that changed everything. "In my hoodie. There's a pocket sewn into the lining. My father put it there before he died." Daniel found William's torn and blood-stained hoodie in a plastic evidence bag on the counter, and with Sarah watching, he felt along the inside until his fingers found a hidden seam. He tore it open and pulled out a micro SD card no bigger than a fingernail, sealed in waterproof plastic. "What's on this?" Daniel asked, holding it up to the light. William's breathing was labored now, the conversation draining his limited energy. "Everything," he whispered. "The Vegas deal, the weapons, the money trail. Diablo's working with corrupt FBI agents to traffic military-grade weapons. My father was going to expose them all, turn the evidence over to the Department of Justice. That's why they killed him in prison, made it look like a riot, but it was an execution." The words landed like grenades in the small recovery room, and Daniel felt the implications spreading like cracks in ice. "The FBI," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Which agents?" William's eyes were closing now, exhaustion pulling him under. "The ones watching your house for the last 3 months, waiting for me to surface. They knew I had the evidence. They knew I'd come to Daniel eventually, because of the photograph, because of brotherhood." Daniel's mind raced through the last 3 months. Had he noticed surveillance, unmarked cars, unusual activity around their Riverside neighborhood? Had he been so focused on club business and the Vegas fallout that he'd missed federal agents monitoring his family? Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip urgent. "If corrupt FBI agents are involved, if they know William's here and talking, they'll come for him. For us. For the evidence." She looked at Detective Marcus, who'd been listening from the doorway with growing alarm. "We need protection. Real protection, not local cops who won't know which federal agents to trust." Marcus pulled out his phone, started making calls, but Daniel was staring at the micro SD card in his hand, smaller than a postage stamp, but apparently worth killing for, worth destroying families for, worth 6 months of hunting a homeless 14-year-old boy through the streets of Riverside. "We upload this," Daniel said. "Blast it across the internet. Send copies to every media outlet and Justice Department internal affairs. Once it's public, William stops being a target." Sarah nodded, already thinking tactically. But we need time. And they'll know he's awake. They'll be monitoring hospital communications. The lights went out. Not gradually, not with warning, just instant darkness punctuated by the emergency lights clicking on 3 seconds later in their dim red glow. The monitors around William's bed went dark, then flickered back to battery power with warning beeps. Sarah moved immediately to the window, peering through the blinds at the parking garage across the street, and Daniel saw her body go rigid. "Get down," she said, her voice carrying the command authority of a combat sergeant, and Daniel dropped to the floor, pulling William's bed down with him just as the first laser sight painted a red dot across the pillow where William's head had been seconds before. 3 more dots appeared on the walls, tracking movement, seeking targets, and Sarah yanked the blinds closed while staying below the window line. "Sniper team," she said. "Professional positioning, federal-grade equipment. These aren't Diablo's gang members." Detective Marcus was on his radio calling for backup, but Daniel understood with cold certainty that backup wouldn't matter because the people aiming laser sights through the window had badges and credentials and unlimited resources, and they weren't coming to arrest anyone. They were coming to eliminate witnesses and recover evidence and make sure the truth about Vegas and weapons trafficking and corrupt federal agents stayed buried forever, and as the emergency lights cast everything in. Blood-red shadows and Williams' monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm, and Sarah positioned herself between the window and her family with the expression of a soldier preparing for her last stand. Daniel realized they were trapped in a hospital room with nowhere to run and enemies with badges closing in from every direction. And the micro-SD card in his pocket felt like it was burning through his skin because it was the only thing keeping them alive and the only thing guaranteeing they'd all die. And somewhere in the darkness outside those windows, people who were supposed to protect and serve were lining up shots to murder a 14-year-old boy and anyone who tried to stop them. The hospital's backup generators kicked in with a mechanical groan that echoed through the walls, but the main power stayed dead, and Daniel understood immediately that this wasn't a random outage. Someone had cut the external lines to create chaos and cover for what came next. Detective Marcus was shouting into his radio about federal agents requiring immediate assistance, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty because how do you call for backup when you don't know which badges to trust? Sarah had moved William's hospital bed away from the window and was stripping 4 lines with practiced efficiency, her combat medic training overriding hospital protocol because staying in this room meant death. "We need to move now," she said, disconnecting the last monitor while William groaned in pain. "Daniel, help me get him mobile." Daniel grabbed a wheelchair from the corner, and together they transferred William from the bed, the boy's face going gray as his surgery wounds protested the movement. Through the closed blinds, Daniel could see shadows moving in the parking garage across the street. Multiple figures repositioning, coordinating, preparing for an assault that would come fast and overwhelming. Marcus ended his radio call with an expression that confirmed Daniel's worst fears. "Federal marshals are entering the building now," he said. "But their credentials are flagged in the system. These aren't legitimate witness protection. These are the people Sarah was hiding from." He pulled his service weapon and moved to the door, checking the hallway. There's a service corridor that connects to the maintenance tunnels beneath the medical complex. Built in the 1960s when this was a military treatment facility. Most staff don't even know it exists. Sarah was already pushing William's wheelchair toward the door, her movements economical and purposeful. "Show us," she commanded, and Marcus didn't argue with the tone of a Marine sergeant who'd led troops through Afghan firefights. They moved into the hallway where emergency lights cast everything in crimson shadows, past nurses shepherding confused patients into lockdown rooms, past security guards taking positions at stairwell entrances who looked young and terrified and completely unprepared for what was coming. Marcus led them to a maintenance closet at the end of the corridor, pushing aside mop buckets and cleaning supplies to reveal a steel access hatch set into the floor. "This drops into the old steam tunnel system," he explained, hauling the hatch open to expose a metal ladder descending into darkness. "Runs for 3 blocks underground, Exits at the old county administration building on Magnolia Avenue. Sarah went first, climbing down one-handed while steadying William's wheelchair at the top. Then Daniel lowered the boy down to her waiting arms in a transfer that made William cry out in pain he tried to muffle. Daniel descended next, followed by Marcus, who pulled the hatch closed above them just as they heard heavy boots and shouted commands flooding the fifth floor. Federal marshals, or whoever was wearing those credentials, moving through the hospital with tactical precision and lethal intent. The tunnel was narrow and hot, lined with ancient pipes that hissed and dripped condensation, barely tall enough for Daniel to stand upright. Sarah had William supported against her shoulder, the boy's weight making her stagger, but her expression remaining focused and determined. "Which direction?" she asked Marcus, who'd produced a flashlight from his duty belt and was consulting a mental map of the tunnel system. "East," Marcus said, playing his light across branching passages. "Stay quiet. Sound carries down here, and they'll figure out where we went soon enough." They moved through the darkness in single file, Daniel bringing up the rear with one of the Glocks he'd taken from the Diablo's hitmen, Sarah supporting William in the middle, Marcus navigating at the front. The tunnel floor was slick with decades of moisture and neglect, and William's labored breathing echoed off the concrete walls in a rhythm that sounded like borrowed time running out. Blood was seeping through his hospital gown from surgery wounds torn open by movement, leaving a trail that anyone with a flashlight could follow straight to them. "How far?" Daniel asked, and Marcus answered without turning around. "Quarter mile, maybe less." Behind them, distantly, came the screech of metal on metal, someone opening the access hatch they descended through. Flashlight beams lanced into the tunnel system like searchlights, and voices called out commands to spread and search, and Daniel knew they had maybe 3 minutes before tactical teams flooded these passages. They reached a junction where 4 tunnels converged around an old maintenance room, and Marcus pulled them inside, killing his flashlight. Through the darkness, Daniel could hear water dripping, rats scurrying, and the approaching footsteps of at least 6 people moving through the tunnels in coordinated search patterns. "We're not going to outrun them," Sarah whispered, and Daniel heard the tactical calculation in her voice. She was measuring odds and angles and time, coming to the same conclusion he'd already reached. They were trapped in underground passages with a critically injured teenager and armed federal agents closing in from multiple directions. "Call Viper," Daniel said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "Tell him we're coming out at the county building. We need extraction, and we need it armed and ready." He dialed his club president while Sarah checked William's pulse with fingers pressed against his throat, counting heartbeats that were coming too fast and too weak. Viper answered immediately, his voice tense with worry. "Talk to me, brother," Daniel explained in rapid sentences. "The corrupt FBI agents, the tunnel escape, the micro SD card with evidence that could bring down a federal weapons trafficking operation. We're outnumbered and outgunned," Daniel said. "I need every patch member you can get to Magnolia Avenue in the next 5 minutes, and I need them ready for war." Viper's response was immediate. "We're already rolling. 20 bikes, full colors, armed and angry. You protected Reaper's kid, now the club protects you." The line went dead and Daniel felt something uncurl in his chest. Not relief exactly, but the solid knowledge that he wasn't alone, that brotherhood meant something beyond words and leather patches. The flashlight beams were getting closer now, maybe 50 yards away, and voices were calling out clear as tactical teams swept side passages. Marcus looked at Daniel with the expression of someone making a difficult choice. "I'll buy you time," he said. "Draw them back the way we came. Give you a chance to reach the exit." Sarah started to protest, but Marcus cut her off. "I served with you in Kabul, Sergeant Reeves. I know what you sacrificed. Now let me do the same." He moved toward the tunnel entrance before anyone could stop him, calling out, "Federal agent, identify yourselves." And the flashlight beams immediately swung toward his voice, converging on his position with tactical efficiency. Daniel grabbed Sarah and William, and they ran, or as close to running as they could manage, with William barely conscious between them, through the remaining tunnel passages toward a ladder that climbed toward street level. Behind them came shouting and scuffling, and Marcus's voice raised in authoritative challenge, buying them precious seconds with his badge and his courage. They reached the ladder, and Sarah went up first, testing the exit hatch, finding it locked from the outside. "Rusted shut," she said, bracing her back against it and pushing with her legs. The metal groaned but didn't give, and Daniel climbed up beside her, both of them pushing together while William sagged against the ladder below them. The hatch shrieked and gave way, flooding the tunnel with afternoon sunlight that felt like salvation. Sarah emerged first into an alley behind the old county administration building, and Daniel pushed William up after her with strength born of desperation. He'd just cleared the hatch himself when he heard motorcycles. Not one or two, but a rolling thunder of Harley engines that made the air vibrate with sound and fury. 20 Hells Angels bikers roared into the alley, Viper at the front on his custom chopper, the club's full colors on display in defiant announcement that they were here and ready for whatever came next. Behind them came 3 pickup trucks carrying more members, and Daniel had never been so grateful to see his brothers as they formed a defensive perimeter around the alley entrance. Viper dismounted and clasped Daniel's forearm in the traditional greeting. "Where's the evidence?" he asked, and Daniel pulled the micro SD card from his pocket. "Right here. Everything Marcus Chun died protecting. We need to upload it now, blast it everywhere, before they can stop us." Viper produced a laptop from his saddlebag. The club kept tech equipment for exactly these situations, and Daniel inserted the card while Sarah worked on William, pressing fresh bandages against reopening wounds. The laptop screen filled with files. Financial records, surveillance footage, communications between Diablo's gang leadership and FBI agents, weapons transaction logs, shipping manifest for military hardware that should have been destroyed but was instead sold to criminal organizations. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, impossible to deny. "Uploading to encrypted servers," Viper said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Automatic distribution to every major news outlet, Department of Justice Internal Affairs, congressional oversight committees, and a dozen backup locations across the dark web." He glanced at Daniel. "Once this goes live, there's no taking it back. Subscribe now. Justice doesn't wait for anyone who hesitates. You're declaring war on corrupt federal agents." Daniel thought about Marcus Chun taking 3 bullets meant for him, about William living homeless for 8 months carrying evidence that could have gotten him killed, about Sarah faking her death to escape the same people who were hunting them now, about Amelia traumatized in a hospital room wondering if her parents would survive the day. "Upload it," Daniel said. "All of it. Right now." Viper hit enter, and the files began spreading across the internet like wildfire. Irreversible, unstoppable, the truth finally breaking free after 6 months of deadly silence. Within seconds, major news networks were picking up the story, Justice Department servers were flagging the evidence, and the corrupt FBI agents hunting them were receiving alerts that their crimes had just gone public. The standoff lasted exactly 4 minutes. Federal marshals, the real ones this time, along with FBI internal affairs agents and Department of Justice investigators, swarmed the area in response to the uploaded evidence, surrounding both the Hells Angels and the corrupt tactical unit that emerged from the tunnel system. There was a tense moment when Daniel thought bullets would fly, when 20 bikers faced off against federal agents with unclear allegiances and loaded weapons. But then the legitimate law enforcement began separating and arresting the corrupt agents whose faces appeared in the uploaded surveillance footage. The tactical unit commander who'd been leading the assault threw down his weapon and tried to run, but Viper's brothers tackled him in the alley with enthusiasm that bordered on excessive. Within an hour the scene was controlled, corrupt agents in handcuffs, news helicopters circling overhead broadcasting live footage of the biggest federal corruption scandal in decades. Sarah was interviewed by Justice Department officials who confirmed her witness protection status and apologized for the security breach that had exposed her identity. Detective Marcus emerged from the tunnels bruised but alive, his actions buying crucial time that had saved them all. William was rushed back to Riverside University Medical Center under heavy guard. undergoing emergency surgery to repair the damage from his escape. Daniel and Sarah waited in the surgical wing for 8 hours while doctors worked to stabilize the boy whose sacrifice had started this entire cascade. Amelia was brought from protective custody, reunited with her parents in a moment of tears and desperate hugging that felt like breathing after drowning. When William finally emerged from surgery, stable but facing months of recovery, the surgeon delivered news that made Daniel's knees weak with relief. "He's going to make it," the doctor said, exhausted but smiling. "Full recovery expected. That kid is tougher than anyone I've ever operated on." The Hells Angels chapter held an emergency vote in the hospital parking lot that evening. Every patch member present, 23 of them, voted unanimously to adopt William into the club family, making him Little Reaper in honor of his father, guaranteeing he'd never be homeless or alone or unprotected again. The club also voted to cover all medical expenses from their emergency fund, the money Daniel had worried about suddenly appearing through brotherhood and collective sacrifice. Sarah and Daniel stood together in William's recovery room that night, watching the boy sleep peacefully for the first time in 8 months, and they talked quietly about their marriage and the lies and the future. "I should have trusted you with the truth," Sarah said, her hand finding Daniel's in the darkness. "I was afraid of losing you and Amelia if you knew who I really was." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. "I should have looked harder for William. Should have kept my promise to Marcus sooner. We both carry regrets." They agreed to attend counseling, to rebuild trust through honesty and time, to accept that their marriage would never be simple but could still be strong. Amelia curled up in a chair between them, finally asleep after hours of being too scared to close her eyes, and Daniel looked at his broken, complicated, surviving family and felt something like hope. 6 months later, William stood in the backyard of Daniel and Sarah's Riverside home during his 16th birthday party, surrounded by Hells Angels brothers and their families, looking healthy and whole and genuinely happy for the first time since his father died. His physical therapy had progressed faster than expected, leaving him with only slight stiffness in his left shoulder, and he'd started 10th grade at Riverside High, with Amelia proudly introducing him as her brother to anyone who'd listen. The corruption trial had concluded with 17 federal agents and 8 Diablos members convicted on weapons trafficking charges, and Marcus Chen's name had been posthumously cleared with full honors. Sarah had testified again, this time successfully bringing down Hawthorne Security Group completely, and her witness protection status had been lifted, allowing her to live openly as Sarah Reeves, former Marine combat medic and current hero. Daniel stood at the grill flipping burgers, while Viper regaled younger club members with exaggerated stories of the tunnel escape, and Sarah sat with other biker wives planning the club's annual charity ride. William approached Daniel carrying his father's photograph in a new frame, Amelia's birthday gift to him, and set it on the patio table where Marcus's face could watch over the celebration. "Thank you," William said quietly, "for keeping your promise, for giving me a family." Daniel set down the grill spatula and pulled the boy into a hug that felt like closing a circle, honoring a debt, fulfilling an oath made to a dying brother. "Brotherhood doesn't end with blood," Daniel said, echoing the words written on the photograph. "Your father saved me. You saved my family. Now we're all even, and we move forward together." William nodded against Daniel's shoulder, and across the yard Amelia called for her brother to come see the cake she'd decorated herself. Chocolate with way too much frosting, exactly how William had mentioned liking it weeks ago when Sarah asked about his favorite foods. As the sun set over Riverside and the party continued into evening with music and laughter and the sound of family being loud and alive and grateful, Daniel watched Sarah teaching William and Amelia how to dance, her Marine discipline softened by genuine joy, her secrets finally shared and accepted. And he thought about how close they'd all come to losing everything, how violence and lies and corruption had nearly destroyed them. But brotherhood and sacrifice and love had proven stronger. Marcus Chen's photograph sat on the patio table throughout the celebration, and if Daniel squinted in the fading light, he could almost see his old friend smiling, satisfied that his son was finally home, finally safe, finally surrounded by the family Marcus had always wanted to give him. The Grenade attack felt like a lifetime ago instead of 6 months, and though the scars remained, physical and emotional, they were healing together, bound by shared trauma and chosen family, and the unbreakable knowledge that they'd faced darkness and survived. Subscribe and never miss a story about the families who fight for each other. William blew out his birthday candles surrounded by people who loved him, and Daniel stood with his arm around Sarah watching their son, because that's what William was now, not by blood but by choice. Make a wish on his 16th birthday that finally, after years of loss and loneliness, had a real chance of coming true.